All right, welcome back to On Patrol podcast with myself, Wyndehurst Productions, and joining me again.
Fighting Kentuckian, and I'm happy to be here. Hope you guys had a good little break from us, and we're happy to be back on the mic and recording.
Since last episode, our inaugural episode, we both, really tried to reach out and engage with the community. So for today's episode, that's what we're going to talk about: community, all the facets that come along with that. But before we get started, we wanted to introduce a new section called Alibis, Caveats, and Piggybacks. Now, anybody who served in the armed forces, I imagine for any armed forces in the world, but I know specifically for our good old US of A, you have heard one of those phrases, and you've heard it with dread. We both have our experiences at the end of the day where it's a Friday. For me, it's usually a Friday, and they're doing a staff briefing or something, and it's like, okay, as soon as this is done, I get to go home, start my weekend. Commander French talking, and then the first sergeant is like, just to piggyback off the commander there, goes into his 30-minute tirade, and then the flight chief, like, just to piggyback off the first sergeant, goes on and on and on. So we don't want it to be like that, but we did feel it was important to piggyback off of our last episode with information and things we got from the community as this two-way street that we wanted to address. Fightin Kentucky, I know you've got some experience in that, and you can start us off as well.
Yeah, this is just in order to caveat, like we had heard people do. We hope that this is a section where we want your comments, we want your emails and your messages, and just like we had talked about, of who we had spoken to earlier and in this community, and what a great episode to even talk about this. Wanted it to be a two-way street, of feedback and content. So you don't want this to divulge, like Wyndehurst had said, into a downward spiral of just hear every comment out there for half an hour. We want it to go in a direction. And so, the idea being is what did we miss? What did we not get right in the last episode? And what are things, that we can, your thoughts on either, whoa, you completely whiffed here, guys, or yeah, kudos, I think you got this one right, or hey, why don't you expound on this a little bit better? And, in our last episode of historical wargaming, we talked a lot about barriers came up, and what are barriers, and then what were interests and what kind of got you sparked and going. And one barrier that we didn't hit, but I think we totally whiffed and missed the ball on, was brought up by a good buddy of mine, Mike, in North Carolina, and he talked about finances. And I completely agree, and hopefully that's the only time I say that for this episode. But finances is a huge barrier sometimes on getting into the game or getting every game you want, and so I definitely think it should be annotated. Why can't we just all win the lottery and then that barrier would be gone? The idea being is that definitely it's something that should be out there, and you see it in the hobby, right? You see it. That's why some manufacturers are going away from medals. That's why skirmish games you always think are coming into their own or being king. I'm partial to Yorkshire Gamer. I think that the big game should come back. Hopefully, we get a renaissance of it. But barrier and finances, you have to account for it. You have to understand it, and you have to kind of put it in. And so we thought, based on Mike giving me that tip of the cap and saying, hey, we missed this one. We wanted to at least put it in our alibi, caveat, and piggyback section here as definitely a barrier that should be in, should be thought of, and how to mitigate that and go around it. Wyndehurst, I know you got some other feedback and comments as well.
Yeah, so I also got one from Peter Hansma, also from North Carolina, who said he didn't feel like we did a decent job in the barrier for scale. We talked a lot about the scale in the size of the miniatures, but he felt like we kind of overlooked or didn't go in depth enough about the scale of command level that people are in, and as that being a barrier. If you're interested in big command level scales, so you're using small models of a huge battlefield, even down to sometimes virtually counters instead of almost like minis based on the size, it can be hard to find people. That can be a barrier for you because a lot of people are more interested in larger scale models because they look pretty on the table. And so that is a barrier, that is a struggle. There not a lot of good ways around that barrier. We'll talk about some things in the community that can help you around that here in this episode. But that was one we kind of also neglected in the beginning. But I feel like we'll answer some of those with community in this one.
Those are so great tip of the caps, to those guys. And I know we had a few other responses, and we're hopefully weaving those in, kind of general responses from other people as we continue on throughout this podcast. And so, moving kind of on, but helping, tying in one of these alibis and caveats is one of the best assets we have in the wargaming community is the community itself. And we really appreciate everyone's feedbacks, critiques, and comments. Keep them coming. Now, on that note, let's kind of dive and outline the episode of the wargaming community that we're about to talk about. And so one of the feedbacks that we talked about from last episode was, who is our audience? We mentioned it. I think we could have done a little bit better job. Apparently, if somebody else brings it up, is that, our target audience was everybody in the last episode. Kind of, if you're a veteran or a rookie, or you're, historical wargaming curious, we wanted to, put stuff out there that you could get. So that's why we talked about a little, some things like Kriegsbilling at what we'd consider kind of introductory education into wargaming, and then we dove into, deep dive on rule sets and other things as far as, passions and interests in those things. But here today we want to outline, when we're talking about community, who's our audience. And, wanted to be clear about this. We believe there's three major groups that, we're targeting in this episode. And those are, number one, people who are trying to get a community started. So people who want to participate, who want to grow, who want to build, those things. People, number two would be people who are trying to re-energize a community. And so those people, maybe are in a ebb or, kind of a low point of their community, or something's changed here, and maybe they'll listen to some of the things that we talk about and say, yep, that's directly, related, and here's maybe how we can get better. And then people who have a thriving community, as our third. So again, started, re-energize, started number one, re-energize number two, and then thriving number three. And so that just kind of goes back to our alibis, caveats, and piggyback, is that we know we don't have all the tricks and tips, and we know that we don't have all the answers, and that we hope that this is an open exchange of information between everyone that will allow us to get, just to better our hobby, our games, and the community at large. So with that in mind, as you're listening to this episode, I hope you fall broadly into one of those three categories, or you've been a part of a community in one of those three categories, and you can help us, as we embark on this on patrol, and you're grabbing your like we've said in the past, your spear, your shield, your musket, or your belt-fed machine gun, and be aware, be vigilant, and help us kind of hopefully break this up, and send us some emails and comments on if you think we missed anything, we got it right, or there's stuff that we should have expounded on again. So without further ado, I'll hand it back over to Wyndehurst to get us going in community.
All right, so bear with us. So I'm going to start off by saying what is community, and then kind of what is a wargaming community. Now, it might seem a little silly, but you have to remember that we're both military professionals, and we can't help ourselves with a briefing kind of going into, well, here's the definition. But I do think it's important.
Professional is a loose term in the Army, but
yeah,
it's probably professional. But go ahead.
Yeah, so with community, according to the dictionary, depending which one you look at, a unified body of individuals. Either one, such as a people with a common interest living in a particular area, or kind of broad area, or two, a group of people with a common characteristic or interest living together within a larger society. So the way that applies in a wargaming community, the first one, broad area, I think is kind of looking at the community globally that we connect with online, and through even magazines and stuff. And then the second kind of part of that definition, locally, is kind of more your gaming group. So really that's kind of two or more people, right? Small gaming groups, wargaming clubs, even card-carrying members of organizations and clubs, which is kind of going to be our focus on this episode for the most part. but that larger global community that we access through online, through forums, Facebook, Instagram, private messages, is pretty significant. I know social media gets a bad rap in a lot of areas, but I think it's one area that it's been helpful for is connecting the global community of wargamers, especially since it's such a niche hobby. I think it's not something to ignore, and we will touch on a little bit here. So Kentuckian, hand it back to you, and why don't you take us on into the next section?
Yeah, and those are great kind of points. If you're listening to this podcast, this is part of the community as hopefully we can make. And the idea being is that again, like Wyndehurst said, the focus is going to be on those clubs or maybe smaller groups or gaming groups, person to person, that we'll talk about today. But in Wyndehurst, a lot have private messaged each other online. Use forums, use groups, and all those things to continue to be part of the community. So don't. We'll talk a little bit about those on weaving them in today and those things, but definitely our breakdown is going to be on, I think, the person-to-person game and community at large. So the things that can make or break a community, we wanted to go through a list today and, kind of pro and con the list together, but we wanted to break them up into buckets. And as you know, as soon as you start breaking things down to fit in cookie cutter corners, sometimes things are going to be missed or going to be skewed and, might not fall into that perfect category. But we felt that it would be a good way for listeners to maybe follow along, to try to put those things in the buckets themselves. And then, again, as always, give us some feedback if you think there are things that we missed or can expand on more. But in getting into what binds that community, that gaming community together, and sometimes can break it down, we're going to pro-con these lists. These 5 things are going to be, number 1, games. Number 2, diversity. And number 3, members. Number 4, frequency. And number 5, location. And so we're gonna dive deeper into each one of what those 5 things mean, and we're gonna tee it up here with games themselves. And so what I mean about a game is just that, a war game that just kind of stands the test of time. And again, looking through the lens of what binds a community or breaks a community. A good war game is, can always build groups around it. It is, these game systems that are out there that have, in your mind is probably coming to your mind maybe Bolt Action or Flames of War or some of these other, Napoleon's Battles back when I was a kid, or some of these other systems out there that just they've built the community around it. The game itself is good. The game itself brings people, and the game itself kind of stands up. It's got more people that are for it than are critics. Not to say that there aren't critics of games, but if you go down to your local store, a good test of this is what's being played. And we'll determine whether 40K or whatever is a good game. I'm not being critical of that, but if people are playing it and it's got a group together, then it's got to be a good game, even if it's not your specific thing that makes your heart go pitter patter. It's forming a group and a community. And when we're proing these good games, building groups, these games themselves, time is kind of a subcategory of what I think is a good game. Maybe the game has a great time to help other participants get in there and play that, and so it can be played in an appropriate amount of time. I think most war gamers are looking for that 2 hour and a half, give or take, of something where they can fit in. And so I think games most of the time that form a community and hold one together will have a time, and not to say that it's not going to be a weekend or an all-day game, but sometimes time will be a good pro of that. The next kind of subcategory of games for pro is, and I want to look at this because I think it plays directly into time, is competitive games and historical games. And so let's pro these out and give the pros for each one individually. So competitive games, the reason they can form, I think, groups around them is because they're not creating, a specific battle or period. Therefore, they don't have maybe the immense detail that other games do. competitive games allow for players to just build lists, show up, and face an opponent. And there's a lot of competitive games out there that have the historical backdrop, like Bolt Action, Flames of War, or a lot of the Warhammer Ancient Battles, Warrior, used to be WRG, all of these things, DBA, those things that have that backdrop, but they allow the player to kind of show up and play a quick game. There is little requirement besides having the army and maybe some terrain, and so, um, you know, I think competitive games receive a lot of flack from, I think, more of a purist historical wargamers, but I think the pro in is all the things I said. Um, Ease of play, ease of transition, and those things. And you know, you can, hey, Wyndehurst, I'm going to meet you down at the local store. Let's play something, 1944. I got Germans, you bring your Americans. We'll do 1,000 points, and we'll set up some bocage table, and we're done. Not a lot of thought has went into that, maybe in coming up with a list, and maybe 5 to 20 minutes getting all that stuff put away and making it out, and then going down to your local club and executing. Whereas, I think that's a pro of competitive games and building a community. It's easier to get more people into that without the level of detail that they would need. Historical games, on the other sense, are the pro on that is, again, for the same reason, sometimes you'll have people and the like-minded individuals of wanting that historical flavor and feel for that game, and they're like, man, that game just gets it. And whether it's the terrain, the way that troops are represented on the field, or a little bit of all the above, they're just like, hey, that hits the nail on the head. I see competitive games as far as timing and the time and those things edging out historical games, obviously, because most of the competitive game groups are bigger, but that's my first thought on pros with games. Wyndehurst, what do you think as far as the pros with games building or our community?
Yeah, so for in the context of building or re-energizing a community, and just to clarify, when we're talking about competitive versus historical, our focus here in On Patrol is historical. So that's kind of like comparing, like, maybe bolt action to, say, chain of command. Would you agree with that distinction there, Kentuckian?
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
I think that, yeah.
So by competitive is like bolt action is a historically themed and historically set game, but the rules and the points mechanic that it kind of relies heavily on don't lend it to a very accurate historical play. Whereas another historical games, meaning games that the historical setting you're playing might require more work, more setup beforehand. To like, well, you're going to do this game, and we're not. Might not even have a point system, so you have to do a little work into it. The pros in those, I agree with Kentuckian, is look what's popular if you're trying to build or start community. That's something like where bolt action is useful. It's got an easy entry and learning curve to it to get players into the game. And once they've got that World War II collection, you can move into more historical games. But if you find that the people around you are more interested in maybe historical periods or actual battles, then that might not be the direction you want to go, because they'll start playing that game and they'll start feeling like, wow, this doesn't capture what I'm interested in. It doesn't represent my understanding of that particular period very well. So just be cognizant of those two things, and look at what the players might be interested in when you're talking to them. There are so many rules out there, and unfortunately, there are a lot of good rules that just have gotten replaced by the new shiny thing. So if you got a set of rules that in the past has been really popular, or that you're just really passionate about, you might find something similar to kind of draw people in. Because games is the heart of wargaming. So a good game is what draws people in, or finding good games. That's all I got for pros.
These pros are, what we kind of see just at first blush with, again, we're talking about what is binding a community here. And so there are great games that are, not competitive, that bind a community. I think growing up, A lot of Fire and Fury was played my local communities and stuff, and that Civil War game, it's not really got tournament lists. It's all historical order of battle. But once you have these brigades and you can plug and play, it makes it really easy to do the refights. So whatever the game is, sometimes we feel it can really, build a community unto itself, just because it's a good game, and so that's the pro of it. On the opposite side, remember what we talked about, these 5 big things: games, diversity, members, frequency, and location. And we've started with games. We want to con games. What is the con to the game and your community? And so during our discussions and in preparing for this episode, we talked about, what can maybe sometimes fracture a group, when talking about a game. And one of the things that we really discussed was when a group sometimes is married to a system or a game. And so the inverse of a good game, is a good game that's kind of is a bad game, but then also can be a good game that's been beaten to death. And so this could stifle new members or force members out because of a lack of variation. And, hey, if this is all that we play, and this is, we don't do anything else. We only play one period here and one scale, and everybody knows it. And then, the idea being, if with stifling, well, then it's always a refight. If everybody knows the rules and you've played it for months and, possibly years at your community, then it's like, hey, who wants to play this scenario? Well, we always know how it ends because everybody's tried it, 5 different ways. Like, it's time to move on. And not to say that does or doesn't happen anymore, but it's just one thing that we think, in some of the groups that we've been a part of, we can see as, being a con is just overplaying that system to a point of, hey, there's no variation, and it doesn't work. The next one as a con that we think too, was time. And so I think time, we talked about in the pro section, but we can also talk about in the con section in sticking with that game. Most games will tell you in the rule book what the appropriate amount of time is to play, the specific game, or a round of that, or what even what the turn is supposed to represent. And so sometimes these, the time is in a great period where somebody who's in this hobby can execute it, and we find that as a pro. It's that 2 hour, hour and a half, 3 hours, or hey, if your gaming community is into it, that weekend or that campaign or whatever may be going on. Time somehow, sometimes as well, when you're looking at that game, can be a con because the group supports the game, but the time constraint kind of restricts the group. There's a lot of really heady games I like to play out there, and campaigns and league battles with people, but unfortunately, sometimes our schedules don't always align, and so, I've personally seen that as being a con, in because, hey, that game that I love to play, unfortunately, I can't play it in that amount of time that me and my buddy need to, and sometimes that's a restrictive factor. The next one, kind of mentioned it in the pros, and just to elaborate on a little bit more, is competitive games and historical game cons. And so 2 that I want to touch on, but again, I think there's a lot of depth to it, is competitive game cons in themselves, and I don't want to diverge when we get to actual members, but sometimes they will drive, as in their title, towards competition. And when you bring out competition in a war game, sometimes it can really, I think, exacerbate some unfortunate results. You can have people, obviously, that, most of us are playing war games for fun, whether it's competitive or we enjoy the hobby or those things, but sometimes you can lose sight of, that community word and really focus on the competitive nature of it, and that can unfortunately lead to some downward spirals in the group, whether, you're always kicking up the weaker army, or you're just list building to go towards a particular thing. And we definitely think, when you're looking at competitive games, that can be a con. Well, I'm going to go find the trick or tip or the min max of this, in this rule set, so I can just kick everybody's face in. And sometimes arms races are fun when you're playing against members sometimes, but they definitely can lead down a bad path. So that's just a con. The historical game con is, I I think this is a great thing and a bad thing sometimes. Is the history lesson that historical games can sometimes divulge down, which is um, I enjoy small talk in gaming. I think it's a social environment. I think that's where it's supposed to be. I enjoy, people that put time into their units. I enjoy GMs taking over games, giving us the idea of, where it's set, what's going on, and what's going into it. But I think some players, after you're on the second hour of explaining to us what the weather was like on this day, there might be, that could also be a con as far as the game system itself. And if you're into a historical game that has a lot of depth to it, sometimes when you're in a community and you're lecturing again about how this actually fought or how this worked, I rather enjoy it sometimes, and I think it really adds another layer to the game itself for me. But again, it's like eating steak or being inebriated, right? Too much of a good thing is a bad thing, and so I agree with that sentiment, and so those are what I see as cons when we're talking about the game. Wyndehurst, what are your thoughts on being married to a system, the time, or the competitive versus historical game con?
Yeah, I kind of. So I just again remember we're looking at this, guys, in the context of starting or re-energizing community. So we're not saying that being married to a system is bad in and of itself. You love the rules and the people in your community love those rules. That's great. But you need to be mindful that being married to a system can prohibit new players because you all know the system really well and you might love fighting it, and they come and they play with you a couple of games and there's like, well, what else do you play? And it's like, well, we don't really play anything else. We might only play this or this handful of games, which I kind of had an experience with joining a group. And Saga came out and I wanted to play Saga, and a bunch of the guys in groups like, oh man, I don't like learning new rules anymore. I've got like my brain's full of the ones I know, and that's all I'm going to play. And that really put me off until fortunately there were some members of the group that were like down to play anything. So not saying it's bad, just be mindful if you're trying to grow, start, or re-energize a community, that being married to a system can be one of your blind sides. And the same with time. If you all in your existing community or you as an individual like a game that is really short or really long, that might not be conducive to trying to start or build a community if the majority of the people that you're drawing in are the opposite. If they, I had a lot of problems when I was trying to start a club. A lot of the venues I was looking at, could only give me maybe 3 or 4 hours. Well, you can generally play a good game in that amount of time, but if I have to set everything up and tear it down because I'm trying to start this community, maybe the game I got to really be cognizant of the game I'm picking, that it can be played in that time frame. Even if I want to play a game for longer, that might not be ideal if you're trying to start a gaming community. So again, something to be mindful. Not saying short or long games are bad, just you have to be mindful. And the same with competitive games. I know a lot of people who will play games like Bolt Action and they don't care as much about the history. There are genuinely gamers out there who love to get into the numbers, to look at what's the best combination, to depending on the objective you're going to play within the realm of the rules, not necessarily the historical side. And that is a fine way to play if that's what you're into. It's not everyone's boat though, and so if you're playing a lot of those are the games you're trying to get your community started on, that's a lot of the individuals who might draw in, who are kind of focused on winning and not the historical element. So if you're trying to start a historical community, you need to be aware of that. They have their place. They're great if you want to run a tournament as a way to re-energize a community, those kind of rules. But just be aware. It's the same with the historical. If it takes a lot of explaining to understand the setting of the game, that might not be great for starting a community. However, I caveat that with I have seen guys who, and I have also myself, run games at museums, maybe on the anniversary of something, a particular battle or whatever. And if you're running one that's themed with whatever's going on there, then maybe it is perfectly acceptable in that setting to go into the details of the battle, the wind conditions, things that led up to it. know your audience really if you're trying to build that community, because those people might actually be there for more of the history side and then experience it through the war game, and then you've kind of drawn them in. So none of those things
Yeah,
are
and the
bad.
only
Yeah, go ahead.
only thing I'll add to that is I think that's Wyndehurst hits the nail on the head with knowing your audience. Is again the last kind of the thing that we were talking about when who is our audience here is we know some of you out here are thriving and your communities are thriving. Please, shoot us a message on. We talked about things that we've experienced in our communities and those things as far as the game itself and pro and conning it. But what do you feel is the necessary? Maybe your GM does a little write up and you can read it or not, or maybe he does the brief and it's just succinct enough that you think it hits it on the head, or maybe this is you have another issue with competitive games. Please give us that feedback and let us know, because we also want to know, in giving our own opinions, what have you seen that's been successful and what hasn't. But I'll let you take over, Wyndehurst.
Yeah. So, yeah, I don't think there's anything more we can really say on games. But again, if we missed something, please let us know. That does kind of tie into, or the next we want to talk to about is diversity. So at first, when we were coming up with these, I was thinking diversity, like in what's the term is normally used in the types of people, and I do feel like that's a relevant topic to talk about in wargaming. But that's not what we're going to talk about today. That might be something in a future episode. This is kind of tying back to game, so diversity in games, and periods, so different rules, different periods, as well as in maybe who's running games and the types of things you're doing. So it can be, for a pro, diversity, it can be refreshing, right? It can be good to try different rules, different levels of command you're going through. So you might do a skirmish level that's a 1-to-1 ratio, and then the next time you're maybe doing the same period but zoomed out into like a battalion level or something, the whole army. And that can be a nice change up to get you the whole picture of the historical period, or even jumping through historical periods can be really good. If you have a member who's very interested in something that maybe you've never really considered, and so like, hey, maybe it's the samurai era, Japanese warriors, and you've never touched it, don't know anything about it, and someone's like, hey, I have the models and this rule set, I'd like to run a game, and then you join in that game, and it's just a nice change of pace and maybe expose you to something you're unfamiliar with. So the diversity in rules and the willingness to let other people run games. If you always have, the same person running games, you're probably not going to have a lot of diversity in the types of games you play. New player, especially when you have new players come in, giving them the opportunity to run something that they're interested in, or picking even the something. If they're coming in and they don't have anything, they don't know any rules, but then finding out from them what interests you historically. And if they're like, oh man, I just love Vikings, like, all right, well, how about next time we do a Viking game, I bring everything, I've got a great set of rules, and you're letting them kind of dictate the change up, and that might be good for you, and it helps encourage these new players if you're building, trying to build or re-energize a community. Kentuckian, what's your experience with diversity?
Yeah, I think the rotation, like you said, with refreshing and then allowing members to lead is kind of key on diversity. As far as a pro, if you're playing a game system all the time and you've worn it out, it sometimes can lead down to hey, I don't want to do this more. We've played the same battle. Not to say that you can't rotate the systems you play and do those things, but when you've played it consistently, for few months or 6 to 8 months or something, and you've just beaten a dead horse there, you need that good rotation. And so I think it can go in a bunch of different areas. I think, like you said, I've seen that happen and be very constructive, where hey, we're going to play this skirmish of this one bigger battle that happened on the end, and then we're going to play the actual bigger battle, based on those results. And so that gives you a little bit of oh, hey, I'm a different commander, even though we're using maybe a different system or those. Or hey, we're going to play something with spears and shields, this day, and then next day we're in, modern combat with futuristic weapons and those things. And so that allows, I think, for players to be like, okay, this is new and different, and it's another way to think, and however you go about that is, I think it can make a group healthy in not playing the same system, and allowing for some type of rotation and kind of cleanse the palate. As far as the members to lead, I think that is just, you hit the nail on the head. Most of the groups that I've seen and interacted with, and lived in several states now, and done a lot with different groups and communities. I think when they allow people to kind of take the lead on a particular system or a monthly or weekly game night and say, who's running it now, and somebody takes the mantle, it really can just make the group and community that much stronger, because hey, maybe that's that person's forte, maybe that's that period they really like, they spend a lot of time in the money, in the miniatures, the terrain, the history of it, and not getting too much into where they scare people off, but they really put an extra effort into it. And when you don't have that, sometimes you'll have the burnout, and you'll have one individual kind of spearheading all games and carrying the group, and then again, they're only human, they can break down sometimes, or just are getting it out of it. If you've got a group of a handful or a dozen people, or no matter who it is, I think that good rotation of members leading is definitely a pro for diversity in leading the game, as well as what systems and rules you're playing.
Yeah, I definitely agree with what you said about. I hadn't thought it until you said it about preventing the burnout, especially in the context of stabilizing, re-energizing, or starting community. If your community is struggling, maybe it's because you've got one or two guys, individuals who have been running everything, and they're just burnt out, and so it's your community suffering, and all it could take is just giving other people the opportunity to pick up the mantle. So let's go into some of the cons with diversity. So there's kind of one big one that we're calling whiplash and no stability. So like we talked about, being married to the system earlier isn't necessarily a bad thing. It can be good to have that refreshing, but you have to be mindful as well. The problem you can run into is that your games are all over the place, and that might be hard for individuals who really enjoy the game and want to play maybe that particular rule set more. And maybe there's a new player and you've played it twice already, and they got there for the third game, but you're going to move on to a new game next week, and they're like, oh well, I really liked that game, I'd like to play more of it. It's something to be mindful of. Or maybe someone's come in, they've played 2 games with the club, they really like it, and so they're like, I'm going to start painting up a force for that. And so they go out and they buy, they maybe drop $100 or something on models for that particular rule set or period. And by the time they're done, the community's moved on to different games. So that is something to be mindful of. I would say if you're starting a community, or trying to revitalize it, really you've got to be mindful of new players. Maybe making sure that they have access to stuff that club members can bring for them to play, and having conversations. Like if they express an interest in a rule set, that they want to collect it, then be like, okay, well, once you have, like, set a limit or a goal, how many points or whatever it is, or a size, and it's like, all right, once you get that painted, we'll come back and start playing that again, and put it on the calendar, if you will. Gives them a goal to paint towards. Like, okay, well, in next month, for the third game that month, we're going to play this rules again. So let's see how much you can get painted then, and we'll do it again. Yeah, that's the big one for me. Kentuckian, what do you got?
The whiplash and stability is, again, keeping all the things that we're talking about, like Wyndehurst said, through the lens of this community, is sometimes that can be, preclude people in the community when you're jumping all over the place. Not to say that if you're hosting the games and you're running the events and you're the one that's spearheading it, like, sometimes that's great, but most of the time we know that with community gaming, it takes a while if people haven't played the game to get the rules down. And it takes a while to kind of walk everybody through, right? That first turn of a club game, or whether it's 2 or 3 people or 6 or 8, that you're playing, is always really slow. There's a few people that aren't very sure, have never played the system, don't understand it, and there are a few people, hey, I gotta recheck, and so that that whiplash that you can get when you're jumping around from period to period every week or something like that is not the same as a good healthy amount of diversity that I've seen in club games where it's like, hey, everybody's got their ACW, let's play this like maybe a few weeks in a row or a month or two, and then let's see where we want to go, or maybe we'll conclude with a big game. Here's the period, or here's what's going to go on, versus hey, today we're playing 6 millimeter Punic War, and tomorrow we're going to be playing Force on Force, Modern Combat, and then the next week we're going to be playing Black Powder Napoleonics. And I love that. I mean, that's great. That's awesome, if your group has the ability to have all those collections. But there's something that's going to be lost with that amount of diversity in that short amount of time. And so I think this really kind of hits that nail on the head, and what is healthy and then what is too much. But no, those are the only kind of thoughts I have on diversity. And so we'll go ahead and start on our third category of what we see with a good, healthy community, and what are things that can either build it up or kind of tear it apart. And I think, it's everybody understands this one. It's members. And so the people that make up your community, again, just like we said, that's you and one other guy or gal who play historical war games or wargaming that period, or you and a multitude of thousands or whatever it is in your local area that play it. And so one of the things that I have with pros and members is generally enjoy other players' company. I understand that most of us, this is a hobby, that it's our spare time. We all can't, maybe painting, and maybe if you worked for the company or anything, but we all really don't make money by playing the war games that we just love to play. And so if I'm taking my time out of my day and I'm going up to grab my army and roll some dice with somebody, I'll shake their hand and be social and be, hey, what's going on? It's all great. That's something that I look for in members of a community or a group. And a big one for members, and I think like a kind of a baseline, I'd say, for this pro would be helpful and supportive. And so that can be in anything from rules, terrain, armies, demonstration games, hobby tips and tricks. It doesn't mean that they're just always giving you an attaboy or an attagirl and patting you on the back. I mean, helpful and supportive can mean constructive criticism, which I've really enjoyed. Some members who, will help me, walk me through some rules of even systems I feel like I had down, and be like, hey, this is actually how you play that, or this is actually how it works, or versus, hey, how do you paint white on this miniature, or how do you do this type of skin or this type of terrain, and here's how you do it, here's some things I think I've seen that you've messed up on this, but here's how you do it now. And that's been very, very fortunate. I think an old adage of this that I've heard from other wargaming members and stuff, when you're looking at members of a community and the good and the pro for it, is good members can make a bad game fun, but a good game can't make a bad member fun. And you can see that sometimes at convention games or games in your community where it's, okay, the rules maybe miss the boat. We can all be critical of them, but the way that person plays and the banter, and they make it exciting, or they'll keep you into it, or it's like, hey, maybe that's what the rules said, but this seems, I think we've missed something here. Let's enjoy ourselves and let's have a hoot. That's where I see that really shining. And so, hopefully we'll all try to be that helpful and supportive member that, when they need to, offers constructive criticism. But those people in my mind are really the weaving, that holds the community together at bottom. What are your thoughts on kind of pros and members, Wyndehurst?
Yeah, I definitely agree with a lot of what you were saying, everything you were saying. I'm constantly surprised. My wife's always telling me how amazed she is about how friendly and supportive the community is. The wargaming community is, by and large, just from her seeing my interaction with it. So if you're trying to start a community locally or re-energize it, that's one of the things I think that makes it great, is being helpful and supportive. If you're trying to bring new members in, and you're not being helpful or supportive to the new guy, they're probably not going to stay around. Now, what being helpful and supportive is different based off every situation. Like Kentuckian said, if that's letting them pick rules, helping them make terrain. If I've got a particular interested new player who seems really committed, I've given them some extra old unpainted models that probably won't see my bench for the next decade, because it gives them something to work on and gets them invested. Just trying to support them. So if you're trying to build these communities, you need to try to be that individual, because that's something that's great about the larger community, and that's, I think, what keeps people in. They might come for the shiny, good-looking models. Some of you who follow me on Facebook might send my posts about, I'd rather have a pretty table with poor rules than amazing rules with poor table. Well, the big caveat that people called me out on, and I 100% agree with, is the number one thing is having good people to play with. And that's where good members comes into. It's having those, is being the fun person to play with. That sets the whole tempo for your community if you're inclusive and supportive and friendly. So that, to me, that's the biggest pro.
Yeah, and so I think we've got that common theme there of helpful and supportive and being a good member and what does that look like. And now to just kind of, the contra of that would be the con. So, ooh, man, you're in your hobby shop on a Friday or Saturday and the door kicks open and it's like a Wild West movie, of a saloon. And herein walks that member that maybe he who shall not be named or she who shall not be named, but this person, when you're talking about, their, it goes beyond, their hygiene or anything else like that, or race, religion, color. None of that matters, in my mind. It comes down to what I would categorize them as. There's always that one person in a group or a community that normally is just a little rough around the edges, and so that in to break it down in nicer terms would be criticism or just even competitiveness. But the criticism, if you look at that end of the spectrum at the first, it's not constructive. It's done in a demeaning or demoralizing way, and it kind of takes the fun out of the hobby. Just like we had kind of echoed back, this is a hobby. Most of us aren't able to feed our families or pay our mortgages off this stuff, and so we do it for fun and we do it for pastime, and we do it to because our passion kind of calls us to. And so when you have that person who is just overly critical and demeaning and demoralizing, it can really suck the fun out of the hobby or the group and the community. And so same thing true when we talked about kind of competitive gaming with this member, is this person is win at all costs. And I don't know if cheating, I'm sure this member goes into that, or there's been members in groups that people have had before with cheating and those things, but there are members who look, they lose sight of the fact that this community is woven together by the interactions we have, and they focus on that table alone and the miniatures on that table, and they're curt and they're crass, and they really steal the joy out of the air. And I've got countless stories. I'm sure Wyndehurst does as well. I just know of people, when you get out that line of sight measuring tape or anything else like that. Not to say you shouldn't do that in some of the, if you're playing a tournament or things like that, but if it's a friendly pickup game, or if it's a friendly club game or group game, I don't know if arguing until you're blue in the face is the real method to win any type of thing in there. And even if it is, if you might be right on this sense, I don't know if you should break it down, right? There's some times where disengaging in this type of person is the best way to handle it. But I'm very curious, and for all you listeners out there, please, I think shoot us a message on some of the members and gaming communities. We'll protect the identities of all those involved, but I'm very curious on what you've encountered. I mean, I think if you haven't been at a table personally where somebody has walked off, you've probably seen it or you've heard about it in a club, and it's just fractured. And sometimes when you look back on the club or the community, people even forget what that was about. But just somebody flew off the handle, or somebody didn't like that interpretation or the way it broke down, and that's not what they wanted to get out of the game. And that's, I think, going into the game itself, and the competitiveness, or the reading, being a rules lawyer, or whatever else it is when you're talking about a community. But just to reiterate, that criticism is also can be up there. So when you're giving those pointers, you're helping, making sure your community is thriving and those things. Be careful with, that criticism. I know you spend a lot of time, or I'm sure you have, if you have a passion in a project or a hobby, and you want to make sure you're hitting it right. And so you definitely, you've read it, you understand it, and so sometimes it's hard to keep a muzzle on when you're trying to impart it to everybody. But be encouraging. Remember, you were the lad or lass that one time who started painting those minis and getting them out there, and just make sure that if you're growing, re-energizing, or trying to have your community continue to thrive, make sure that you're guarded against those things, and see if you can be part of the solution in diffusing them, or assisting or helping out. Maybe that person who is this member who we've talked about as a con, maybe the community being healthy, maybe you can talk to them, maybe you can meet them on their own, or maybe you can help kind of control that level, to keep your community thriving. What are your thoughts on con Wyndehurst when you talk about that?
Yeah. So this is you definitely agree. This is a tough one to fix. I agree. The people you have to watch out for are, you're going to have, like Kentuckian said, those who are win at all costs, because their enjoyment out of the hobby is winning the game. And that's not really conducive to building a community. That's good for tournament play, when it's, the focus for a lot of people there is winning. You also are going to run into those people who are control freaks. They think they have the best idea in the room. They're trying to dictate everything. You also might get some of those individuals who just are socially awkward, because this hobby does, it's diverse in many ways. I really would like to hear from the community on this one, because some of those are really hard. Like, I don't know the best way to solve them. If you've got a member who is obnoxious and rude, and a bad sportsman, got an elastic tape measure, what's the best way to handle that? How do you politely ask them to stop or go away? Really, I mean, I don't know. I have seen it as a problem in communities. Generally, people just tend to ignore them, or not play with them, or keep an eye on them. But it's a challenge. And I also think, like Kentuckian said, you need to guard yourself from becoming that person, especially if you're starting a community. Because you have to think, if you're trying to start a wargaming community, you're passionate enough that you're like, I want to get more people into this. I want more people around here. I want this to become a thing. You're inevitably going to draw people into it, who might be more experienced in the hobby than you are. They might know better. They might have more experience in building community. Once maybe they've discovered you and like, oh, I didn't know there were other like-minded people, and they've done this before. Don't be so focused on that this is your thing. This is my community, because it's not your community. It's a community. It's not your thing. It's not, unless you're starting a club in your house, then by all means, you can be the authoritarian rule on it. But if you're trying to start a community with those around you, you need to guard yourself from becoming that kind of control freak, that what's best. And being willing to listen to people and feedback, but also either being the person or finding the right person to step up and deal with those malcontents, as they were. And it's a challenge, and I don't know the best way to handle those. It would be good to hear from the community on ways that they've experienced personally.
And not to say that we don't have any experience. I think we've talked kind of off air about both of us on members, and just like what you said, Wyndehurst, either you've seen the group isolate them, or you've seen them fracture community, or those things. But we have the personal stories we've told a little bit about. But I'm curious too, if somebody, what have been your personal experiences, just like Wyndehurst said about, if you feel like you have a successful tactic, technique, or procedure that has worked, maybe, and to be worked, maybe more than once, let us know. Most of the time we see isolation or, a little bit more of a guardedness as a group against that person is the way ahead. But
Yeah.
interested in other opinions and ideas. And I'll hand it back to you, Wyndehurst.
Yeah, and with the criticism part of that, you might be like, I want to start a historical wargaming community, and you're passionate about things being pretty accurate. Just remember, you're bringing in new people. Their painting level or devotion to painting might not be at your level. Have a little flexibility, and that trying, if you're giving criticism, to make sure it is constructive and not demeaning. Um, you know, you want more players, and someone who's not exactly the level you're at might become one day if you just give them the time. So just keep that in mind. So moving on from members, we're going to start talking about the frequency. So that's like the frequency of games. So really, the pro on this, we're looking at regularly scheduled events can really help keep a group healthy. It creates new players, right? Community events and games show new players that might be interested, that there is a community nearby. The more often you run them, or consistently that you run them, gives a better chance that new people might see it. That they might see, oh, okay, it's not just a one-off thing, and therein lies the important part, right? You gotta be consistent. If you are trying to start a club that meets weekly or bi-monthly or monthly or however often, being consistent with that so that players can kind of schedule their life to accommodate this new thing they're trying to do, or if it's game nights or tournament nights or whatever it is. So make sure, if you want it to be a positive, a pro towards your community, is the being consistent with that. And it helps people scratch that wargaming itch, if they can get it in enough. Yeah. Kentuckian, anything to add?
Yeah, the frequencies and the pros. I think you nailed it on, creating new players. I think anytime I've tried to, demo games or get it out there, advertising, hey, this is when I'm going to be here and this is when I'm going to play, or even if your club is doing that pretty regularly, hey, we meet once a month on this date here, or we do this, at this time, or everybody has enough notice. I think it keeps those regulars regular. It also shows people who are curious we're committed. We're not the Continental Militia here. I'm not going to fire one shot, do a great World War II game or ancient combat game, and then I'm off in the night. You
Yeah. I have to say, I've been
it's
really impressed with, I give you a shout out here, Kentuckian, with your level of consistency. So for those who don't know, we kind of met back in North Carolina when I think it was when you were advertising a bolt action tournament. So I mean, just the consistency I've seen you build communities with, starting with demo games and then going into like an escalation league to encourage people to build more armies, and then rolling into a tournament. Like it. I haven't seen it. You might have had experiences where it has, but in the two times I've seen you do it, two different locations, I haven't seen it fail. Like I see the community grow up around that level of consistency and involvement is pretty impressive.
Well, and I'd love to say that I just happened onto that, but I will say it's a lot of failures led to that
Yeah.
formula. And I think that's what I got my nose punched in a lot. I think when I was trying to build a community at one of my earlier locations with how do I best get this? And so building from the ground up, and we'll talk more about personal experiences at the end of this. I think is a good way to do it. So when you're consistent and you've got that, and the regulars are regular, and the new players are like, hey, don't have this going on this Saturday or this weekend. I've always seen those guys in there playing that game. I'm gonna go in on this weekend. I see they even advertised it. I'm just gonna give it a shout. I want to see what it's all about. That's crucial. So I think you've nailed it on the other pros for that. But that's what I see as being the pros for frequency.
Yeah. So the cons, and this is actually something I'm really struggling with the communities here. It's either too frequent or not often enough. So here, a lot of the local communities actually, for me, almost meet too frequently. A lot of them meet every week. Well, now that's not necessarily a bad thing, except that because they're meeting every week, they're meeting every weekday. They might meet like every Monday or every Tuesday or every Wednesday, depending on the different club. And they've chosen that because they want to meet so regularly. They've chosen a weeknight because they'd rather give up every Monday night instead of every Saturday, which is fair. But because that's the level of frequency they want, it kind of excludes me, who can't really game on weekdays so much. On the other hand, you might get too few where if they're only meeting once a month, that one day that they're meeting might not work for some players. They just, that day isn't good, or they're planning on it, and then something comes up and they can't be there that day, and now they have to wait a whole month. Whereas the too frequently, if they're running a campaign or a series of linked games and you miss 1 or 2 weeks because you went on holiday, then you're coming back and you're behind the curve. So for when it comes to building a community or re-energizing, that's something to be aware of, and it's a hard one, really. I have seen one club that, and I've heard that others will do. They do their weekly games during the week, and then once a month they'll do like a Sunday and do a whole game of Sunday. So that's a good way to kind of find a happy space if it works for you, but you definitely got to be aware of that. Kentuckian, you have anything to add to the cons for frequency?
Yeah, I think it's that porridge, right? Too hot and cold,
Yeah.
and it doesn't. You're never going to get it quite right? Because the whole idea with a community is if you're depending on more than one person, and you're going to get a consensus, it's going to hurt for somebody. It's going to be not the right night or not the right venue. So I think if you're a member, you're starting, like we said, or you're a member in that thriving community, I think frequency, it's going to have to be democratic, hopefully, for that community to have staying power. And so it's going to just have to go on the good of the group of what it is. And so hopefully us as other members, I think we both have, just like you'd said, we've been members where it works for us, or members where we're on the fringe. There's a great group here in Nashville that games. Shout out to Track and Hole Club. They game every Tuesday night, and it's a great group of guys and gals. They play a lot of the pros that I've seen in this list are in that group. But unfortunately for me, I'm about an hour away, and it's on a weeknight when I got to wake up and do PT in the morning. A little bit of a push, although I've just wrapped up a league, so I plan to get down there a little bit more. But keeping a healthy community is making sure a majority of the members, it works for them. It definitely works for those guys and gals in Nashville, and I think they've got a great little bastion of historical wargaming there. And so if you haven't seen them, look for their group on Facebook. That's a shout out to them. They're doing a good job. But yeah, that's as far as the con and pro of frequency. I'd say the con is we've all been there, probably been burnt by the amount of too many games or too few games, and so it's just something to keep in mind, to definitely guard against when you're trying to make your community thrive or not.
One thing I'd like to add before we move on that you said, sorry to interrupt, but I think it's important. So you mentioned that group. They meet every week, right, on a Tuesday, but it's an hour for you to get down there, hour and change.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that right there, that's something to keep in mind if you're trying to build a community, is how big a net are you trying to cast? If there's a lot of people locally, you can probably afford to meet more frequently. But if people have to drive or commute a distance to get there, you're probably not going to catch them weekly, and to the point where they're just not even going to bother coming on one-offs, because it's like, oh, I'm only going to be able to make it once this month, and they're playing 4 other times. I'm not going to be involved as much. So I definitely think that your experience there is a good example of maybe when the often versus fewer times is really carries more weight.
I definitely think I'm the exception to their rule, because they have, at least a dozen to, more there on their Tuesday nights. And it's just where I live, towards the Army base. But yeah, as far as other communities that are thriving and growing, yeah, you might have that 1 or 2 members that hopefully wants to be a great member of that group. But again, it should always, I think when you're talking about community, it's democratic society, like the Senate here, just voting for the majority. And so I think they have a good niche, but I think you've made a very important point as far as when you're looking to keep your community healthy or build one, you should definitely take that into account of who you think is going to be able to attend and what works for the majority of the group. Any other thoughts on con frequency before I
No,
move
sir.
on?
No, go ahead.
All right, so the last one that we wanted to talk about, and again in our 5 categories, the quick rehash being just, we've talked about games, pros and cons, talked about diversity, pros and cons. Again, that mainly means rotation of games and what games are being played. And we both kind of agree that might be a subset of games, but we wanted to give it its own little facet. We talked about members, pros and cons, frequency, pros and cons of how often you're playing. Last one we wanna think that is a broad category for community building, re-energizing, or thriving is location. So the pros that we see in the first parts of this, and I'm breaking these down into these categories, are single location, rotating location, house, store, or your humble abode, right? Your own little house. So the pro to go down, the first one would be single location. I think you're looking at your community or your thriving community or re-energizing or whatever it is, single location is pretty good because it allows the players to have some fidelity. It can be inviting, I think, most of all to new members. If they want to come and observe your game and they want to see what it's all about before they go in. Because as we know, communities grow and ebb and flow and change. But, we're always hopeful that somebody comes up to the table and it piques their interest, right? All that means for us is we have more opponents, more people to throw dice with, knock back some beers with maybe, or your drink of choice, and have more laughs and fun with. Hopefully, if you're not that abysmal member, that will work out for you. I think the pro in the single location is, fidelity, and it's more inviting, I think, more often than not than for newer members. Second one would be the rotating location. I think this works for some communities because you've got different houses or stores that allow for players or locations to not have the significant lifts all the time, right? So we can rotate, the house, we play at this store on this part of the month, we play at this store at this part of the month. It allows for a shifting of, kind of the burdens and responsibilities with that. We'll get into the cons of that here in a second, but it can be good and a pro if those significant lifts matter, and especially if you're looking in distance, right? If you've got a group that's spread out or wide, and I'm talking hundreds of miles maybe, if you're shifting cities or ways you're going to play, hey, I'll drive an hour to you guys this at the beginning of the month, you drive an hour to me at the end, something like that could be beneficial. The third one for pro would be clubhouse. So I think that it's a rarity here in the States as far as a clubhouse. I mainly see stores and houses. Definitely a pro would be paid for, you got storage, you can leave things there, and it can be pretty definitely consistent almost, it's its own single location, so I would agree with that, but that can be a lot of good pros in having one point of failure that's not just a storefront or somebody's humble abode. And the last two are basically that, the pros for a store. A store is super beneficial because obviously it can stock the game you can play, the systems you play, you can keep it out at your house. It's kind of separated. Hey, that's the stores where I go to unwind. I can, it's got a lot of fidelity. It's neutral ground for all of the community members, the opponents, and even observers, and they can, people will feel more likely to, hey, I just saw him playing at that table, I want to pick up the rule book, or maybe a tiny army or something like that. And so it's got a lot of good pros for a store, and I think United States, when we talk about communities, I think most of the communities are going to revolve around either one store or a series of store. And the last thing that, as far as a pro is location, would be your house. And so the pro about the house, obviously, is terrain and miniatures don't have to travel far. And I can't tell you how much terrain and how many miniatures I've broken in transit, right, just going down to the local store. But it does happen from time to time. And when you've got them there and you just got to pop them over to the table, that really can definitely be a combat multiplier and help out. And I mean, just as Wyndehurst had said, the tear down time and the setting up time, if you can leave it set up on a table like I've done with my, trying to think of the longest amount I've left a table out. It has to be a month or longer, before I've had to tear it down or we've been able to finish a game or something like that. That is definitely critical in the location being a pro. So again, just to recap, those are for locations: single location, a rotating location, or then the last three would be a clubhouse, a store, and a house. What are your thoughts, Wyndehurst, on those being pros?
Yeah, so I think clubhouse, store, and house all fall under either they could be a single location that your community is playing at, or you're rotating between any number of those. Generally, I would say it's hard to say which is single versus rotating is better if you're trying to start a community. I mean, if you have a game room or a game building that's yours, and you're lucky enough to have a converted outbuilding or garage or something, that might be a good place to run games. It's your house, you got all your stuff there, but is it a good way to show people your community? It's hard to say. But pros. That is the thing about a single location, is that fidelity, that consistency. If it's a store or something, everyone knows where it's going to be every time. If it's at a clubhouse, like he said, paid storage. So a lot of the clubs here in the UK I've seen will include some sort of area they can store some terrain and tables and stuff, and they'll be locked up until the club comes back and uses them again. And that's really handy for building that community because you have some stuff on hand. So maybe you're only bringing your armies and some specific pieces of terrain for your games. That might make it easier. Whereas a rotating location could be more beneficial when building community. If it's like, I'm going to bump through the stores in my area for the maximum visibility, or local library, local community center, different places like that, because you're trying to gain community support for the club or the hobby, museums and things. Sometimes it's really advantageous to rotate around. And like Kentuckian said, like the travel thing, he and I were about a little over an hour apart when we were both stationed in North Carolina, and so I didn't really have a gameplay, so I would go down there, but my garage got finished right before I PCS'd, unfortunately, but it would have been great for going down there when he hosts games, and then he could have come up when I was hosting games and things like that. So there's definitely something to be said for those rotating. I think a lot of us would agree that our hobby goals in life would be to have that man cave game room in our house. But if you're thinking about community, that might not always be the best place. But I think we'll get those in. We'll cover some of that in the cons section.
Yeah, no, excellent points. I definitely, I know you were driving a certain ways, especially when we first started rolling some dice together. So those were great points. Take those locations now and kind of turn them on their head. Let's look at some of the cons on those. And when you single location and the rotating location, like you said, those are the umbrellas I think that the others fit under. The single location is, that single point of failure. And there's been a lot of times where I've scheduled events or demos. I would say events normally, you're pretty airtight on what's going on. But, somebody's interested in the game and you message them online. You're like, yeah, I'll meet you down here this Saturday. I've got off and everything. It's like, it's a game table at the store. I'll definitely be able to play it. Then, unfortunately, they have maybe an event that has shifted or something else has shifted, or maybe everybody's taken up the tables. Well, then you got a single point of failure, I think, for that single location. And that could be anything is a snafu in scheduling, or, a real world event is in, hey, it got shut down today, power got, whatever, had issues, or something else is going on. That single location, being a single point of failure, sometimes can stifle a community, hopefully for not long, but definitely something to think about. Rotating location, the con on it is the lack of consistent space. Keep members away, too far to drive, something gets bumped, etc., etc. Anytime, if you're saying a single location, can have a single point of failure, sometimes with a rotating location, the advantage of having it spread out Also the advantage of having it, break down a little bit more too by the synchronization that sometimes that is required. Looking at the clubhouse idea, and I know you can talk a little bit about this with your time in England and gaming, but cost of a clubhouse, the cost of a space or a venue to rent, and put that into it. We again, wargaming is a hobby to most of us, so we take our discretionary income and maybe a little bit more, right? Don't tell our wives. But we take some of that and we use it to buy miniatures and other things like that. And so sometimes using a chunk of that or something in order to just have a table to pull out and play, or that's what it was supposed to be covering, is sometimes unfortunate. And as you know, in the U.S., if we won't pay for taxation on tea, we're definitely not going to pay for it on our wargaming venues. No, that's my little dig, but I don't know what the attraction is. I know it comes a lot with space, but I also see that communities ebb and flows here, and they have different groups and different variations of that, and so I don't see us doing that. I think one of the community I just mentioned earlier, they game in a bank, a building where one of the members owns that building, and so kind of graciously I think lets the people use that space. So something short of that, I don't know. It seems to be, it would be exception here as a clubhouse. I know the guys in Little Wars TV have this amazing setup and everything, um, and how that's done. I'm sure most people have seen that YouTube channel, understand what I'm talking about, but don't think that seems to be the rule, especially in the States. It's more of a store or a house or some variation. The next one, the con, would be, so my clubhouse con, I would say, is definitely the cost, but the next con would be the store. And so a con on a store would be, it might not support your gamer system. Maybe that's the location for you and your tabletop gamers to meet, but maybe the store won't support that systems. And then sometimes other events in games can cause for competing schedules. It's like we talked about a little bit with single locations and rotating locations. Store, right, tends to fall is a great economic principle. I learned, in getting an MBA, and it's no such thing as a free lunch, and that holds true. The store's got to make money. The store's got to do those things, and historical war gamers, I would say more often than not, are not the cash cow of most hobby stores, and so it's understandable when they're not the priority for scheduling. Sometimes it's card-based games or other games out there, sci-fi, that really drive their revenue. So that makes total sense. It just can be a con for locations at stores. And then the last one would be the house. Significant requirement on the host. I've been to a lot of good houses and not so good houses in being part of a community. I remember the late Bob Duncan. Me and my father went over to his house. He's here in Tennessee, or was. He passed away here not too long ago, the amount of years. But he had just an amazing house, huge wargaming table. I can't even remember how big it was, but hundreds, thousands of miniatures on the table. Always, great host, helping everybody out, making stuff simples down, whether it's rules hanging on the wall or whatever it is, but just really, really does, it above and beyond. And those are great, and that's probably a great example of the house. But on the the con side of it, and what we're digging into right now, is it can be a lot on that individual who's hosting, and I think it can also stifle new players joining. Most of the time it's for a group that know each other, that gamed for each other for a while, or that are getting into that group. And if you're interested in that game, you're probably not getting an invitation over just yet. And so, who is that stranger at my house? It can always be something when you're trying to talk about growing the community and making it better and bigger. Those are just a few, kind of, again, ending on the cons of the location. What are your thoughts on that with the single rotating clubhouse, store, and house, Wyndehurst?
Yeah, I agree. Single point, definitely falls under all of those. Maybe not so much clubhouse. And you're right. So a lot of the clubs here in the UK that since I've been over here, seem to rent like local community buildings, community centers, and they take club dues. So they're proper clubs. A lot of them have charters and everything, elected officials in the club, and they take dues, and that's how they pay for it. And so I guess they don't really have to, because they're willing to put that financial investment in. It kind of helps negate that single point of failure, barring, like they were to game night, there's a water main breaks or something, catastrophe. But it would seem like the best fix for the point of failure is a kind of clubhouse place. But again, I agree with you. I haven't seen that much in the States. I have seen some railroad clubs that will have like a center that they rent and have all their stuff set up in. I don't know why. Yeah, it just doesn't seem to have caught on in the U.S. like it has over here. But you have the single point of failure problem then otherwise with a store or house. And then the rotating location one, the big con I see to that. Let's say it's you're just doing stores, right? You're rotating through stores. Well, I might have come in, on my lunch break or something on a weekend. I just had some time, so I'm stopping to buy something. And hey, look, there's this big group of people playing in the store. Oh, that looks really cool. Well, then they're not back there. They're not back there next week or the week after, and then trying to track down that new community can be really challenging if they're not properly advertised. So that's something to keep in member if you're rotating locations. Definitely having the clubhouse, the costs can be up there. Here doesn't seem too bad. I mean, monthly fees I've seen for some clubs are just a few pounds, a few dollars for us in the U.S. And then, but for stores, so I was getting a buddy into historical wargaming who used to own a brick and mortar store, and he confessed, he's like, listen, because I was trying to start a club and I was having problems with local stores not being super supportive. Just a tabletop wargaming, a lot of them were card driven. He's like, it's economics. You can't fit the same number of players at a 2x4 table or 2x6 table that you can for a war game that you can for a card game. And so that's that many more people in the store. That's that much more revenue turned over and generated. And so historical gaming, I mean, I've seen a lot of stores not even carry historical models. It's card games and, the companies that can afford the over-the-top advertising like GW. So that can be a real challenge if you're trying to start a community and you're looking for what's around. And then, like I said with the house, I think Kentucky nailed it. If you're the host, you're trying to start this community, you don't understand the amount of work that goes involved in setting up a game for a bunch of people in your own home, especially if you don't have a dedicated place. So what, you're going to take over the dining room or the kitchen or something. Convenience, maybe your whole family if you have a family. Plus, if you're starting a community, how well do you know these people? Are you really comfortable having these people into your home? There's all sorts of people interested in the hobby, so that's something you have to consider. It can be really challenging in finding a location when you're trying to start a wargaming community. And that was one of my biggest challenges when I was trying to start one.
Oh yeah, those are great. I think kind of add-on points too, especially when we're looking at the cons and locations. And that concludes kind of the 5 broad categories that we were talking about with community, and looking about what these threads that tie us together and that sometimes we see can fracture, and so in going through these, what is a wargaming community and what can make it better, or sometimes negatively affect it. We had those 5 categories. We've did a little bit of a dive into each one. And again, just to reiterate, those categories were games, diversity, or those rotation of games, not the diversity that we think of when we hear in popular culture. Then members, pro and con, good and bad members, good criticism, bad criticism, good gaming or overly, too competitive, frequency at which your community and your group plays at, and then location, what facilitates the best amount and the most for your community. But we're interested on what you thought of those initial opinions, and we want to hear, maybe certain stories or aspects you can enlighten us on. Again, with Wyndehurst living in the UK for a number of years now, and going on he's got a few more, I think. We do get a little bit of an outside the continental United States variation on it and what we've played, and we've been members overseas. I mentioned on the last episode I'd played in Japan for a good little bit of amount of time. But I would say I want to hear your input on why some things work in your area and why they don't, and give us that feedback and let us know what you thought about what our opinions of those big five categories were. So, without further ado, we just had a few more sections here that we wanted to talk with you today. And the next section that we want to move on to was, audience in that first few was, again, we're going through, you're starting a community, you're re-energizing a community, or what is helping to make your community thrive. We hope that you got something out of that first one, and we hope that you can impart something onto us, especially for those communities that are thriving. This last section wanted to focus on that participant in that community, and if they wanted to, either trying to grow one or re-energizing or help kind of making it thrive. We wanted to focus on some tenets here, overarching tenets that we think have helped us and guided us. And like we said, we always haven't gotten this right. I've had my nose bloodied a lot of the times in going in and embarking on this and coming up with the strategy. I think me and Wyndehurst had mentioned the Mike Tyson quote off air. Everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. Or every plan doesn't survive first contact here, right? And so that's what we want to dive into a little bit next on what are those tenets. And so the first tenet that we see is, in trying to either grow or build or help your community to keep thriving, and you being more than just that person that shows up to roll dice, but actually contributing by making the game or being somebody who the community can depend on for those demos or running the games or events and anything in the between. Is expectation management is number one. I think knowing that you will be going more than halfway, and that's okay. It's not always going to work the way you want it to, but I think expectation management is kind of critical. The best laid plans are not going to directly go that way, and if you're going to be that group member or participant that's kind of spearheading different periods or different rule sets, know that you're going to have to be pushing the ball a little bit more than most. What are your thoughts on that, Wyndehurst, as far as expectation management and those things?
Yeah, especially when it comes to starting a community where one doesn't really exist. It really can be a challenge. You can be scheduling demos or tournaments or whatever and have nobody respond or nobody show up, and that might be, you might have people show that they're interested, but actually commit being a challenge. And often you're going to be the one, maybe by yourself, doing all the setup, all the teardown. If it's demos, maybe you're painting up the armies for both sides. It really takes a lot of effort if you want to, go on this path to start one. If you're trying to revitalize a community, it might be more about getting a group of like-minded people, and that you all have to commit, that you all are going to have to put in the effort to make it thrive again.
Yeah, no, and that's if you go in there with that mindset and you kind of understand that tenet, then you're definitely gonna, I think, get more out of your efforts. Our next tenet that we talked about kind of off air and what we see is one that you need to have in your back pocket if you're being guided by these things or feeling led to do this would be consistency is the next big tenet that we see. Regular demos or regular games that you're running or that you're helping a community kind of stay behind is where this, I think, can be, made or broken. And so, if you're not consistent, that's definitely going to degrade, your level of participation, your level of spearheading it forward. Players have to know, when we talked about frequency, that you're going to have to be in there. Hey, I'm running this game from this date and time group. I'm not shifting it. I understand life happens, but it doesn't happen every time to push you back. And so I think consistency is something that's huge for participants that are looking to take a more active role in the community. And so it definitely should be something that you put in your back pocket as something that's guiding you and making sure people are depending on you and your consistency. What are your thoughts on that, Wyndehurst?
Yeah, the only thing I think when we were talking about this before is If you're committing to like a consistent schedule, you have to commit. You know, you don't be flaky, because no one else is gonna commit if you're not being consistent. If you say you're gonna do it, if you're gonna set up a game, and not just people showing up and playing, but even stores. You know, if you reach out to a store and they agree to let you do a demo, and then you don't show up, you think they're going to be willing to let you do that again? Probably not. So you got to be consistent with what you're committing
Yeah.
to.
Yeah. No, that's right. And then I would say a third tenet would be, invest wisely. And me and Wyndehurst talked about this at great length. I think what that means at bottom is, invest in that game, invest your time, invest in people wisely. So, I just, something that we kind of mentioned off air is I'm in, Western Tennessee, Western Kentucky area right now, stationed for the military. And I think one of the, I couldn't see it as being a hot topic as far as game, right? If I'm investing my time is get out here at the local hobby shops that, that are dealing magic cards and 40K and everything else. I don't think the War of Spanish Succession is going to grab them by the belt buckle. And so even if that's something that is near and dear to my heart or something that I find passionate about, don't know if that's going to help contribute to a community where I can build something around it. So I think be mindful of that game. Doesn't mean I don't have, pet projects that I'm working on that people don't like, or aren't the mainstream media, as far as wargaming is. But if you're looking to build that community and be active in it, again, like we said at the onset of this episode, this mainly focuses on that local peer-to-peer gaming community, that you need to be mindful of what game you're going after and what time period and those things. As far as time, I think you need to invest your time wisely as well. And so that means, what am I doing actually fixing my miniatures and doing the hobby? And what am I investing, as far as playing and putting stuff out there? And where, you know, is that going? Is my time, am I able to hit demo games on, 9 p.m. on a Wednesday night? Is that something that, our participation games, is that going to build my local community? Or is it something where I can, although it's a hard, tight schedule, I need to do it on the weekend, or I need to do it where I think the community is going to be, or what's helping my community to thrive? Is it something that is, that time, that weeknight that helps keep us, sane, or is it something where, now we need to shift? We've lost a couple of members. We're struggling. We need to shift, that time, and we need to make sure we're being wise when we schedule it. And people as well. We talked about, how do you invest in people that are getting into the hobby and going to be part of maybe your wargaming community. And like I think Wyndehurst had said, he'd given away sprues that he knew he wasn't gonna actually get to in his pile of shame. In my mind, I know Wyndehurst, like I did, he gave those away so he could tell his wife, like, hey, I've got room on the project table to order more. But again, twofold in helping spur involvement from other people and saying, like, you'd said you'd really like that show, The Vikings, or you said you'd really like that show, The Pacific. Here's some U.S. Marines. I had some extra ones. Well, here you go. And then, definitely try to cast a wide net, but probably not going to go to the local craft and quilt show and set up a bolt action table or a battle group table or a, Napoleon's battles table. I'm going to get a lot of members, right? That's time, game, and people wisely. So understand your audience, your community, your events, your venues, and see what is helping to kind of feed into that. What do you think about as far as invest wisely with time, game, and people, Wyndehurst?
Yeah, for me, the time side comes to kind of those shows. I spent a lot of time when I was working on my building a community at my last base, in just trying to educate the local populace on that wargaming existed, and it was a big time sink. And I don't know how good the return value was. So there's a lot of pretty much any opportunity I could see for me to set up a booth with some demo stuff or run a participation game, small thing at some event that was even remotely relevant. for a while there I was doing, just because I wanted people to see it and ask me what it was so I could explain, and that we had a club on base, and I was trying to get it out there. And that was a pretty significant time sink, and honestly, at that location, it probably wasn't the best use of my time. And I could have done better in investing my time wisely, just because the return value was so low. And so you got to, you can try different things and try and get a feel for it. And then when it comes to in the game, you might have to build multiple armies, or you might have to consider, you might love this or that period, but it doesn't seem like anyone's interested. Where do you want to put your time? Do you want to put it into the period and the models you love, even if that means they might not see the table much, or do you want to try where lots of people are playing? And so for me, like Bolt Action was an example of that. It wasn't a rule set that I was particularly passionate about, but it's got an easy entry level play to it. It can be played fairly quickly, and so to me, it was a good avenue. It was worth investing in that game to draw new players into the hobby. And then I've already talked about people, and Kentuckian hit it back there for me. But for me, it's worth. I've had people do that for me, reach out and be like, "Hey, oh, you're really interested? Well, I've got some extra of this or that you can have," and that went a long way into encouraging me. And I think not everyone's in a position. I'm not saying go buy a bunch of stuff that you're just going to give out, but you might buy a bunch and give one model out to people, and like, hey, you show. I've done that. I've actually had companies, I'll run demo games and they'll send me freebies to give out. That's something to consider. Or if you have extra, you want to invest, you got the finances to invest in it. It's like, hey, come play in this demo game and get a free whatever. I did that with the World of Tanks game, get a free tank, just to generate interest in the hobby, and in the community.
Yeah, no, those are great points, and I think on how to do everything you can to spur it, investing wisely, and what's wisely. Obviously, we know freebies at that quilt convention is not going to go as far as it seems that you might have with people who are at least passing by, or it's in a fringe of hobby or an event or venue that you can show off. I think the next kind of tenet that we wanted to look at was being flexible to change. And flexibility I don't see as inconsistent with consistency, one of our second kind of tenets here. I think consistency allows you to build on your foundation and shows would-be community members or community members that you already have, like, hey, this is where we're going to be at. But I think being flexible and adaptable allows you to say, I understand life change, I understand this community, it's not going to be the same it was as 5 years ago as it is now, and maybe people want to play different things or do different things. So I think don't be the stick in the mud to that or the roadblock for that. I think if you want to keep your community healthy, be ready to be flexible, be able to merge things if you need to, be able to schedule events and game days, but I think listening to the group and keeping your finger on the pulse of the group will definitely be where that's at, and how that'll lead to that success, hopefully, or your community either continuing to go or continuing to thrive. But what would you think on be flexible to change, Wyndehurst?
And I don't think there's really much more else to add to that. Yeah, it's like we said,
Yeah,
the example I gave, no one might show up, so you just got to roll with it.
exactly. The last tenet that we talked about would be make sure you have the time to invest before embarking. So, make sure that you are ready, I guess, would be this last tenet. Make sure that you understand that being a member of a community is one thing, but helping and being a contributor to that community is completely different. Um, those are marathons. Those are not just sprints. You have to be in it to understand that, if you plant that tree today, it's going to take some cultivation to actually make it grow and develop. And so when you understand that on the outset, and you'll be a little bit more amenable to when you're like, hey, I just ran 3 games down in the last month at my venue, and I don't have any new players yet, or I'm running this event with my community, but nothing's going on, and or with the wargaming club I have now, our community, and it's not generating the interest I thought, or those things. I think just like we talked about earlier, like good people can make bad games fun, and hopefully, if you're looking at being this contributor to the community, or helper or facilitator, then you're looking to be that good person in that game. And so even if it's not everybody's cup of tea, we'll be able to bring those members in and continue to push that ball forward when you understand this is a marathon. Like, you're going to have to lay in there, you're going to have to, get your nose punched in a few times, and be resilient to that and be adaptable and be able to change. But understand, hey, I'm seeing what's going on. I understand that this is going to be a time, and I'm having fun, and I'm doing this at the end of the day, and it's all for the kind of fun, and I'm getting out of it what I want to, and hopefully you're making new members, or keeping your community thriving in the interim. What are your thoughts on that,
Yeah, the
Wyndehurst, as well?
yeah, when we were talking offline, the big thing I think of, that I think is important to talk about is, your significant other or partner, if you have one, because it is a huge time investment. I mean, the hobby alone, even if you're not trying to start a community, if you're just passionate about painting armies and playing games, that takes a lot of time. I mean, it's not an insignificant amount of time, hobby investment. You can make it as much as you want, but if you want the size of the armies I want, and the number of games I'd like to play, it can be a time investment. And so I think it's really important to have the conversation with the person in your life, especially if you share a residence. My wife, I'm very fortunate. My wife is extremely supportive, even of like this podcast. So it's been fairly easy, for me, since I've been married, to do this hobby and to put in that amount of time. And she's been willing even to help out. But like before I was married, way back when, my parents have never really gotten the hobby or understood it. Not to say that they were against it, but even now, my mom will ask my wife, is he spending enough time with you and the kids, or is he, always painting, or is he always doing this or that? And that's, you need to have those conversations with important people in your life, because just like when, for us in the military, we tell our spouse, you're not just marrying me, you're marrying the branch I'm in, you're marrying the service. They're not in it, but there's an expectation from them. If you want to start a community and put in the time and effort investment, if you don't have those conversations, it could adversely affect your relationships. You need to have them on board. Otherwise, one of them's going to suffer. Either you're going to fail at starting the community, or you're going to hurt your relationship with that person. And that's definitely something you need to think about and have a conversation about.
I think that's a super important point, especially if you have a family or significant other. I think, happy wife slash spouse, happy life. And I think there's been a lot of nights, I think, early on when I was trying to do community building, I think many years ago, and I was telling my wife, as we all do, like, oh yeah, I'm just going to go play one game, and you're hoping they're imagining something like an hour, and then text you 2 hours in and you're on like turn 3, and you're like, dang. That can lead to some adverse conversations. And so, or if you're lucky enough to have your spouse, enjoy the hobby with you, those are things that you should be mindful of. So I just think that's a great point that you bring that up, because that's the foundation, that we're allowed to have this hobby time with. And I think it definitely, is a good tenet to have, especially in community building. Okay, the next section that we wanted to talk about and go into a little bit of detail here was, we wanted to just shine some lights on some personal experiences in the community, and we wanted to go back and forth with those things. If you followed Fightin Kentuckian Facebook page at all, I've ran a decent amount of bolt action leagues. I've been a part of a lot of different game system leagues and various game systems, campaigns, leagues, whatever you want to call them. And I feel like I've gotten a little bit of, their TPs, or tactics, techniques, and procedures for success, because I think I've failed so miserably, or I've learned from counterparts who they've let me embark with them, and failed with it. And so one of those things that I think if you're looking at growing a community, you're trying to grow one from the bottom up, and it came out of necessity for me. So the idea that there was a local community, didn't really game the game I wanted to game, and was a little adverse, I think, towards the game I gamed. But I wanted to build those opponents, and I could find onesie twosies, but I was like, man, I really want to stick it with this game. I want to do everything I can. Talk to the manufacturer of the game. Started talking about, like you said, with freebies and other things like that, and then said, how can I design something where I can maybe get people into it? It won't be a huge time sink, and then if you can get a good group together, it'll roll. And so built it from where, was attacking that game from all sides, where, there were points for winning games, there were points for building and painting models, there were points for, themes and those things. And I think that it created me to create a little bit of a broader group push too, because it wasn't just about that game being competitive. And then created the league from a little bit of a that is a very small points number. So in bolt action, in my mind, it's 250 points is not a game. It's very probably a poor game. It's the dice bag would control completely. It's maybe two squads, two 5-man squads, an officer, and like one team would be your 250 points. And so that's a very swingy game. When you're talking about leaving iterations open, where okay, this person may or may not like the game, but they know if they build 5 or 10 models, they can do that in a month, or they can execute that in that amount of time. That'll help kind of grow the game and the league while you're going at a slow pace, but a pace where enough people are playing and it's still being energized, and you're allowed, new players is kind of who it's targeted at. So a lot of mistakes I think I made early on in creating leagues and campaign games with not understanding. My initial one, it was just, hey, I want to make opponents, I want to do this at a level, and then kind of understanding and talking to players and getting feedback from different leagues that I'd started. I think I'm on like my 5th or 6th one now, but how can you what is everybody coming to the table, and what do they want to achieve? Not everybody wants to be the league winner, right? Some people in your groups are painters, some people in your groups are historians and like the history of stuff, people in your groups like the one-off events. And all of this came to kind of its natural conclusion with like, okay, well, let's try to see what everybody wants out of it and see if we can scratch that itch in this league. And so no, not everybody gets a trophy in my league, but there's things to shoot for. And whether it's the amount of infantry you've built, the theme you're going for, you're winning overall, or even if you have that fun tabletop story of your lone Piat hitting this super heavy German tank in the rear, and being able to blow it up, and this most heroic unit award. That allows people, I think, to really dive into whatever you're playing and get something more out of it than I have to win at all costs. And I kind of advise anybody who's coming up with a league, for a game system, to push it forward, to make it not all about winning, because you're real in danger of making a viper's nest when you do things like that. But if you can curtail that enough, that'll help kind of build the community rather than stifle it. Because there's been a lot of communities I think we've all been part of where, as we went back to the cons on members, those super competitive people or critique people will really push players out of the game, and that's not something you want to do when you're trying to start it. So as far as like the league building and community building, I think that's a really good, figure out what the game system and what you're trying to build, and then try to start breaking down of, who do I think my likely candidates are, and what do they really want to get out of the game. And you'll know that, as I did, after you've probably started the league, or the second or third time you've run it, and you've talked to league players after the event, and they're like, I really enjoy painting it. Like, I'll play because you've set this up, Kentuckian, or you've done these things, but my thing is painting, or my thing is I love the consistency that you put on the regular league days, or I love the fact that you do these things, and try to combine as much as you can. And I think anytime you're talking about a group of people, the majority wins. Whatever it is that's driving more and more people, you can cast a wide net, you can create different things that people will try to win or pursue in the league, but then fail on some of those, you don't want it to implode, and you want to make sure that you're keeping a majority of the people engaged. Even if, the original reason I started on these leagues, things was very selfish. It's, hey, I just wanted opponents. Then they grew into something where it's like, man, I just found this guy or gal who enjoys this game, or who does it this way different than me, or who really wanted to build this army, or maybe they're a great painter, or maybe they're the great player, or the great, whatever they are to the system. And it's really creative and helps kind of push us all forward in a different direction. And be mindful of that. Now, we've all been part of leagues, right, that have maybe fallen apart. And if you were in some of my early ones, maybe those fell apart as well, and you can use me as an example. But I think it goes back to those tenets that we talked about, and I think it goes back to the pros and cons. When I look back at leagues I've started and things I've done, it's, I set out rules, or I set out, for communities, I set out rules that maybe had a little bit too much gray area in them, or I wasn't as consistent, or I could have been, or I didn't, maybe do enough of a frequency or a diversity and switching up. Why are people playing this game? Well, I'm only really showing them one facet of it when we play this type of game with the game system or the rules. So, being able to branch out and seeing those. And again, I've had communities where we've done the different locations and different stores, and, I can go back to the drawing board. At the end of the day, there's not really one solution to rule these. I think that's where the being flexible comes in. You have to understand, who makes up your community. What are they trying to get out of it? And I think once you start asking those questions, rather than just being selfish of like, hey, I want to make new opponents so I can play, then you can start to grow and build it. And then, maybe all questions will get answered, hopefully in the way maybe we want. Maybe some will, but maybe, all will. I think at the end of the day, I was able to make more opponents, to play against and enjoy the game with, but I also was able to give those opponents something out of it that they wanted out of the league, which is, that consistent games, those different themes or medals or awards to strive for. And all boats kind of rise with the tide. But let me tell you, I mean, those first few iterations, I looked like a Mike Tyson victim, right, in one of his fights. I definitely have got my blood and bruises from learning those hard lessons. So hopefully you take that into account and understand that. I think a lot of that in community building is look at the people to your left and right that you're trying to build that community with, and try to see if you guys can get on the same page and same sheet of music, and remember to be flexible, and understand that that's a group effort. Even if you're the one spearheading it, it's a group effort. That's probably all to sum up that. What are your thoughts or personal experience from that and looking at the community, Wyndehurst?
Yeah, so I didn't have quite as an eventual successful story. So my real big experience with community building was at my last assignment. So our base in North Carolina had this really great initiative where if you had a club idea, the base would sponsor it and encourage it, and you could have an official base sanctioned club. And obviously I'm a big historical wargamer, so I wanted to start a historical wargaming club, try and introduce it to more people. And man, it was a struggle, and it was a struggle because for I think a number of factors made it really challenging. So I learned a lot, but ultimately it was not terribly successful. I ran it for about 3 years before I changed bases. But there's a lot of things we've talked about I struggled with. So it was a sanctioned club. Now, it was sanctioned through the base. So initially, my target audience was the base goers, either active duty or retirees who had base access, or Department of Defense civilians with base access, which you think would be a prime target audience for historical wargaming. I don't know if it was just that location. I know a number of other clubs there had issues with just people showing up, turning out for things. But I really had a hard time getting people to show up. And because of the base initiative, they would do like quarterly club days where they bring all the clubs out together outside or inside somewhere, and they do like mandatory fun for the rest of the base to show up and do some event, and then they could canvas the clubs, and so I was, every time I was running something. 4th of July parties and celebrations on base, I would set up something. Squadron anniversary party or something, I might set up a display. Just all these, putting a lot of time investment in all these efforts trying to advertise the club with ultimately very little return. Towards the end, I was able to reach out and get some veterans locally who were in the hobby. But right in that local area, it was a real challenge. And even though it was sponsored by the base, there wasn't a dedicated space. So then I'm doing that moving around from space to space. So it was at the enlisted club sometimes or the library sometimes, which all had either their drawbacks, either they weren't very visible or they had time constraints, so everything had to be packed up and out by a certain time. We only had one hobby store locally, but they were very unsupportive. They focused almost entirely on card games, and I could never get them commit to giving me table space to run demo games, which is a real challenge. And there weren't a lot of other opportunities or options in the local community there to do games. And I lived near base, but I didn't have the facilities at my home to run games. So that was a real challenge. I will say the one thing I committed to, since I committed to doing this and I had my wife's family support in doing it, was that consistency. So I advertised that we played once a month, and I think it was like, let's say, the third Saturday of the month or something. We had a dedicated Facebook page I had put together, and I would put on there. I would always ask for the few people on the page what we wanted to play, give them options, what I had, open to suggestions. Trying to get that variety in game out there. And if it was something I had, I would bring everything I had in order to run the game. So I would advertise it as, hey, all you have to show up is with the good sportsmanship attitude. I'll provide you everything else. And still might not get anyone showing up. But if I scheduled a game, that monthly game, I was there. I went there, I would set it up just in case someone came. And sometimes I'd have maybe one or two people. Maybe at the library, be some kids would come, young people would come and play. But I was consistent, I didn't want to take the chance that someone might show up and I not be there. And then that would just kind of destroy my credibility. But it was really a struggle, and it never took off the way I would have liked it. I think I was limiting myself in a lot of ways. And like we talked about, casting that net. I was casting my net pretty small to pretty much the immediate base vicinity. I think if I'd been willing to go further afield or open it up to people further afield, if I could have found a good spot maybe locally, then I could have gotten a better success. So that was some lessons I had learned from that. But yeah, it's not always a success. Like Kentuckian said, he went through a lot of failures before he found a recipe that seemed to work pretty well. That was my first real big attempt, and I, messed around with it, tried different things for 3 years, and it just never really took off. And that doesn't discourage me. I'm fortunate here in the UK. You can throw a stone and hit a club here. Here it's more about finding a club that's a good fit for you. But in the U.S. And other parts of the world, we don't have that luxury. So you've got, if you are passionate about it, you got to commit to it. But yeah, we're just about at 2 hours, so I think that's all I'll say on that.
Yeah, no. And then my last kind of at little point, just personal experience, was just clubs that get it right. Briefly, I talked in our last episode about my kind of upbringing in the wargaming community. It was a lot with my father, and then going to conventions and gaming, right? And that's the opposite, from what you hear outside of the United States and England and some other places, where most of the gaming's done at your stores or your clubs, and then you go to conventions to kind of shop around and see the newbies and what's going on, or maybe participation games. So don't really have a lot to fall back on until I was in secondary education, moved to a different city and started trying to build my own. However, in the military, shifting around, I was able to see some clubs outside the United States and inside the United States and play with them, and really just wanted to highlight some things that I thought some clubs out there were doing right. I know the club in Aberdeen, I don't think it has a formal name, just It's the Sand Hills gamers out there that normally game at Hit Point Hobbies and some stores around there in Fayetteville and next to Fort Bragg, soon to be Fort Liberty. But just the monthly kind of game, the keeping it consistent, and then the diversity of kind of games. They play through different games. Everybody seems to be involved. Although I think there's a few of leaders, who are taxed. I'll say Eric Gray being one of them, a really good painter I know, that helps put on a lot of the games. They do have a good rotation as far as, there was another member that just put on Romans and stuff. They play World War II. They just played naval combat, and those seem to really work for groups and clubs and keeping them consistent. And a shout out to Track and Hole. I think they do the right thing as well. A lot of people that'll step up and put games on there. There's a lot of different variations of games, and there's that consistency that sometimes they play a lot of chain of command there, and that people want to see when they're trying to learn a rule set or getting back to that. I think clubs out there that have highlighted. There's one in Japan, at Zama, where I gamed a lot, that had some consistency with gamers, and it's especially difficult with when you talk about the people that come through there. But it's those people that make those clubs, that are successful. And so my thought in knowing those different clubs over several different years is that they kind of all hit the tenets. And where I pulled the tenets from is that they do have consistency. They have people, that are investing wisely. They're still flexible. I know they play about anything and everything, and they definitely help members feel included, and they bring those people into the fold. Now, not to mention, there's a few people I'm sure that they every club has their difficulties, whether it's, hey, somebody's getting burnt out because they're putting on all the games, or somebody wants to play another different game, or the location is shifting, or all of those things. Not to say they're going to go through those, but I think be mindful of all those things when you're getting into tenants, and you'll be able to figure out what has worked for them. The thing that I think rings true throughout this whole podcast is people make that community, and it is really hard to put any type of cookie cutter against somebody and it work everywhere every time. So you have to be vigilant in how you attack this, but you also have to be understanding. And as much as you want to focus on your output and stuff, you got to definitely listen to the community and what gamers are wanting out of your local community to, I think, be successful. And just like me and Wyndehurst said, we've both been punched in the nose a bunch of times with having our own thoughts about how it's going to work, and then been taught a lot differently. But hopefully that's made us continue to strive at it and get better. And we look forward to the comments that you guys have. But I'll turn it over. I know Wyndehurst was going to talk a little bit about more of one last community story here while we have you. So Wyndehurst, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah, and this kind of goes nicely with what you were saying. So this is kind of an experience I had with the greater hobby community. And this is why we foot stomp so often. We want to hear back from you, because this greater community is amazing. It has to be one of the best, most supportive, friendly communities, hobby communities that exists. The greater wargaming community. So maybe about 3 years ago, when we were in North Carolina, my house was burgled, or more accurately, my garage was burgled, including the room I stored all my hobby stuff. Unfortunately, only one item was taken, and it was a chrome case that my wife had gotten me as a birthday present to store models in. And inside it was my entire 20 mil painted Moderns collection, over 200 models of miniatures. And the whole thing gone. It was never recovered. Dude probably went out into the woods, opened it, was like, what the heck is this? Dumped it, and then, pawned the case. I was pretty heartbroken. But, I don't know if he dumped it. So, I've taken pictures and I'm posting them online, all the forums and stuff. It's like, hey, keep an eye out for these if they're on the market anywhere. It was stolen. It's probably gone, dumped in the woods. But if you see it, it's mine. The amount of support I got from the greater community was, it's hard to describe how great it was. I had multiple companies, like these, little small businesses reach out to me and was like, hey, I've got a bunch of extra casts I can send you, or hey, I'm coming out with this new line. If you pay the shipping, I'll send you a couple, of blisters. And I ended up through the generosity of companies and other players, was able to get was gifted enough miniatures to totally replace what was stolen. Now, granted, they're not painted, so I'll never recoup that time investment. But just the outpouring of support and friendliness from this greater community, it's amazing. And so we don't have all the answers. So if you have answers, let us know. If you're looking for answers, you can't be in a better community to get help if it's on building communities. That's why we're making this, because we love this community and we want to help this community grow. And there are so many people out there, I feel like Kentuckian and myself, who are passionate about it and who care about it and are more than willing and happy to share their experiences and the things that have worked for them or the things that they've seen not work to help you avoid. It really is an amazing community. And I think to kind of end the main talk on community, it just, we're not the one-stop shop. We don't pretend to be. It's what makes this community great is the collective.
Yeah, and I don't know how much I'm up on the ticker right now, but I completely agree.
Not too
with
bad this time.
everything you just said. So that was a good way to end on what we our main topic with community, and now I want to shift to our other sections that we talked about last time. So getting back to one of the things that we talked about was a section that we hope will reappear and continue to reappear was as we wind down this episode, and we haven't drone you on to sleep right now. We've still got a few more minutes to do that. Is kit bag. And so again, like we talked about, those are those, whether self-made, bought, or anything, those are those items or products, that we construct, or like we said, ready-made or bought, that help kind of add a different factor to our game. And we just wanted to show you what was in our kit bag and hopefully get some messages and comments from what's in yours to help us kind of all grow in that direction, if that's what, we enjoy or we find out there that we think somebody else would be like-minded as well. But one of the things that we, put in our kit bag this week, and that it kind of goes with our kit bag, is casualty markers. And it's kind of big. It could probably deserve its own episode at some point on some of the nuances of it. But what are those, and how are they on the table? And let me first say a shout out here. As far as gaming aids and pins and all of those things, one of my normal company go-tos is Historique. Rob Prince does an amazing job. He makes me markers for every game system that I play, and if you message him, whatever the game is, he'll definitely make it for you. But what I'm talking about when I talk about casualty markers are, the painted miniatures or the vignettes that I see, or the dioramas where they add a nuance to it. I'm not a warmonger. I don't really attest to be. I know the horrors of combat are pretty substantial, and being in combat myself, I definitely think they deserve their due, and I don't think that is out on the tabletop. But when I think of casualty markers on the tabletop, I'm thinking of that vignette to show what is going on in the tabletop. Whether it's the one model lying face down, or something that shows the shield painted, the mini that's had the story of like, hey, this is just what happened. I think that kind of helps me, and what I get out of the hobby is that narrative of what just happened on a tabletop. And there's sometimes in game systems where you see a whole division, or you see a whole brigade, or you see even the squad there, and a turn later they're gone. And especially you see that a lot if you're a commander like me, or you have to write a lot of letters home. But those are things where I think, yeah, in my mind, I like to conceptualize that that's a game, and that's how tokens work, right? Whether it's a Union painted brigade or that squad of British Expeditionary Force in World War II, I think some discreet and tasteful casualty models, right? Like, I'm not going to put just boots on the table and be like he was blown out of his boots or anything, right? I do paint, some red blood on mine and those things, but helps kind of tell the narrative of what just happened. And when I take pictures of the game board, I'd like to think, this is a story that I'm involved in now. I do see the game side of it and understand that there's a push, to have some severance there for these were actual people if you're talking about historical wargaming. But I think it can help kind of tell that narrative, help show how the battle is, and to help kind of, at the end of the day, I would play just chit war games, like we talked about in the last episode, if I just wanted to play chit war games. But I enjoy the aesthetic of the wargaming table. I enjoy the topography when I put rolling hills under my cigar box battle mat. I enjoy the mud that I put on my models and those things. And so, in my mind, those can really bring a table to life. A good, tasteful casualty markers that show and tell, how the battle or how the engagement's going or in what direction. What are your thoughts on that in your kit bag,
Yeah,
Wyndehurst?
I really liked what you've done in some of the games I've seen you play and when we play. Where so a lot of companies make casualties, though they're usually for vignettes, I think, or markers like tallies. But I've seen what you've done and just taken them, painted them, and then put them on the battlefield, and it really does lend a nice visual aid to like, it's serious. You lost a whole division, a whole brigade, a whole unit's gone. That's not insignificant. And being able to represent that, I like to use them though as a way to aesthetically, in an aesthetically pleasing way, to represent like the casualty or stress level on a unit. If it's a fatigue marker for Saga, or their wounds in Hail Caesar. I've tried a couple different. I haven't settled on what I think's the best setup. War Bases makes a really nice MDF dial. I'm probably going to use those with my Normans. If you those who follow me on Facebook have seen that for my Anglo Saxons, I made custom little dice trays with a casualty marker, and I could flip the dice around to show their casualties. I don't know if that's the most aesthetically pleasing. It's definitely better than just a lone dice, I think. I've also seen done with a hex base or multiple sided base where you have the number on each one or each alternating one, and then you turn it and face it with the casualty miniature in the middle. But I think those are a really nice way to track like a unit's casualties or pins or whatever it is in a visually aesthetically pleasing way that's not detracting from how nice the table looks by just having a dice or a big counter out there. By making the counter or dice integrated into almost like a vignette, can really add to the immersion, I think, of your setup. That's how I use them.
Yeah, and I've watched your page with great interest. I definitely advise anybody to. I think he's got a really nuanced idea for his casualty bases with his medieval armies. So I definitely continue to follow that with great interest to see how that works out, and I'm excited to see where you're going to take it to, how it'll help kind of the game. And again, just with our kit bag, those who have other ideas on it, or things with casualty figures, like I understand people. I have some friends who I war game with quite often who are just like, I'm not going to paint that. That's like morbid, Matt. What are you doing? You're against, you've got your warmonger or something. And I'm like, no, no, no. It's the storytelling for me. I think it's the idea that I just don't like looking on a table where, I don't want to see 1,000 bodies out there on the field. But when a whole brigade evaporates and maybe there's not like one casualty stand or something, I need it to make sense to me on what just happened. And if you're spending 2 or 3 hours as a time investment, I really like the narrative, the storytelling that it does. Oh no, great kind of point by you, and I really look forward to it, and highly recommend anybody to check out what Wyndehurst is doing with hex bases. Um, our next section, to round us out here in our last section of the day, is our scouting report. And just as we talked about the last time, this is what's on our project bench, what's been on our project bench kind of first, and then where are we going, events, aims, those things. When we talked last time in March, if you can remember that long ago, my project bench had a few Carthaginians left, and getting ready to look towards their Italian nemesis, the Romans. So I've completed the last of the Carthaginian line units. I think there was somewhere around like another unit of foot and some Carthaginian cavalry and stuff. And if you follow my page, completed those guys, lined them out. I still have like a handful of Carthaginian generals to do, and about 50% on my last elephant or two. I already still have 6 elephants in the army, so I'm just finishing these last two. But I went ahead and started cracking on my Romans. So in about a month, I've gotten 18 Romans complete, and I would say somewhere around 30, like 80% done. Another GZO 50 to 75 Romans based and primed, put together, based and primed. So I'm pushing forward. Italy's levying her legions against my Hannibal's army. And I got real big delusions of grandeur of where that project's going to end. But again, the whole purpose of this section is to keep me accountable and where I'm going to go and where I'm coming from. So hopefully the next time that we push out an episode, I'll have at least one legion done. It'll be 100, 200 miniatures. So that's sometime in May. I've got about 20 of those painted right now, so I'm putting the stakes high. We'll see. Hopefully, I can get almost done or close to done with the infantry for a legion by then. But we shall see. Then, as far as events and games, since the last time we talked, I was able to play in a doubles tournament in near Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Ended up being carried by my played like I said in a doubles tournament. Eric, one of my battle buddies, was my partner in that tournament. Ended up carrying me and my Hungarians through that event. We did a lot of, when you get your butt kicked by Italians and early war stuff, something's wrong, or that opponent is just that great. And I did. I got railroaded a few times during that event, but it was a great event by those guys down there. Really happy to participate in it. Really fun time. We wrapped up the our local bolt action league, so I think that is like my 5th or 6th league complete. Had about 20 players. Got a lot of good awards and handed them out. You can check my Facebook page over there. One that I'm really proud of is I gave out a Rookie of the League award. We had Sophia, a young teenage girl who played some Fallschirmjäger and just kicked the crap out of a lot of people. And so really wanted to just highlight her and how we've got a good group and diverse group down here of gamers. Then kind of what's next on the horizon. I talked to you about where I hopefully will stand in the next 30 days on these Romans. But I'm hosting a bolt action tournament, following my outline, right, of building the league and then building the event shortly after on April 29th. It'll be a great event here at a great store in Clarksville, Tennessee, Guild Vault Games. Got about 20 people signed up, about 3 or 4 on the wait list right now. Look excited for that event. Hopefully everybody comes with a great attitude, and a good day of gaming will be had, and hopefully we'll have some good reports on that event. Yeah, that's Fightin Kentuckian scouting report, and I'll it over to you, Wyndehurst, and what's on your workbench and what's on the future.
Yeah, those Romans look pretty good, and I'm looking forward to the pictures from the tournament. Yeah, for me, so let's see. It's on the day of recording. It is April 16th. So Salute is next weekend. So this should be out and live by the time you're listening to it. I'll either be at or just getting ready to go to Salute. By the time, hopefully, you all have this episode out to you all. So I'm looking forward to that. Taking the whole family. Got a hotel down there. That's what's coming up for me for events on the paint table. So as I told you all last time, I had decided that my Norman Anglo-Saxon armies were not sufficient and to be bolstered. So I've been working busy at that. I've got 12 Saxon slingers painted, 10 Norman knights, mounted knights, the commander Bishop Odo all painted up. I've got 12 archers on my bench right in front of me, about 60% done, and a whole bunch more stuff waiting for those armies. I also did, if you're looking at my page, I did two scale trees. There'll be 2 of 7 that I'm planning to do, because I decided I needed some proper wargaming trees, like that really go along with the kind of aesthetic table setup I'm looking at. And I also, if you follow me on Facebook, I got a great game in of Raven Feast with my whole family. So I was able to play that with my 5-year-old and my 8-year-old and my wife, all set up in the living room. That those rules are actually by Little Wars, and they are free online, and I highly recommend them. So that was really fun. So I'll definitely be doing some games of that with my family and getting them on the Facebook page. So that's yeah. So coming up as far as painting is just more Dark Ages stuff. Hopefully by next episode, I've my last cavalry for the Normans. I've got 24 Breton mounted, warriors that I need to. They're all assembled that need to be painted. So I'd like to have all of them done by this time next episode. So that's it for my scout report. Any final thoughts, Winters?
No,
Kentuckian.
alibi on my scouting report is I have some Victory at Seas coming up there. There's a local player, Mark, here, who's gotten me into that game. We've been playing some Blood Red Skies, I forgot to mention. That's led to me playing Naval, I think, here soon. So more follow. I might have a battle report or two up at Victory at Seas. But yeah, no, great stuff on your scouting report too. And man, you are just cranking that stuff out. I thought I was a speed painter, but look at your table of your armies that are complete, and that's just massive. And so now I'm over here like rolling my eyes when you say I don't have enough. So that's crazy, because I feel like you've got enough right now to repel the Norman invaders as far as Saxons go, 1-to-1 scale. But awesome stuff.
Yep.
Yeah, no final thoughts. I hope you really enjoyed our episode. We've put our best foot forward here, I think, and and again, we wanted to make it. I know we're at a lot of time right now, and we've gotten that back as a comment on how long these things are, but we wanted to make sure we gave it not just a total wave top look at what can grow and weave a community together, and what are things some falls to avoid or help trying to control when we look at the cons of that. So I hope you appreciated both of our input on it. I really look forward to the next episode. Again, we look forward to all of your feedback. Me and Wyndehurst really at the care and concern. A lot of people commented back and gave us a lot of different pointers and things to look at and work on. So we look forward to still growing and engaging with you guys and gals, and making sure that we're putting out the best stuff that we can. And it's everybody is contributing, and the whole community is growing and doing better and being healthy. That's where we all rise with the tide. Any last other comments for you, Wyndehurst, before I close this out?
Yep. So just to piggyback off of Fighting Kentuckian, our piggybacks, alibis, and caveats. You may have seen that we did a survey, or we attempted to do a survey, because we really do want your all's feedback. We want to make this something that is beneficial to the community, and we also want to hear back from you on things that you've learned and your experiences that when we can apply in our own situations. And the survey was an attempt to get your all's feedback, and hopefully you'll see that we are serious when we say we want to hear from you. We added the alibis, caveats, and piggybacks to show that we'll address things we missed in last episode. We added an entire section to talk about who the target audience was, like very clearly, because we got the feedback that maybe it wasn't as clear. So we do listen. So whatever platform it is you're listening to this on, feel free to leave a comment. You can also message Fighting Kentuckian or myself, Wyndehurst Productions, on Facebook. We'd love to hear from you. If you have any feedback, thoughts, comments, suggestions on topics, we'd love to hear it. We don't have an agenda laid out. We kind of decide as the month goes on what we want to talk about. So if there's something you want us to talk about, let us know, and we'll see if that's what we make our next episode about. So those are my final thoughts. So Fighting Kentuckian, why don't you see us off?
All right, and we really appreciate all of you, being on patrol with us for this last whatever amount of time you've been able to listen to us over. We finally made it back to the rally point, and we look forward to the next time that you grab your shield, your spear, your musket, or your belt-fed machine gun. You're prepared to join us on the next On Patrol. Get ready and move out.